This is Sonia Wood, a CFM from H2O Partners, here today to talk briefly about the wildfire exception to the waiting period for the initial purchase of flood insurance. Normally, all new policies that are not loan-related have a 30-day waiting period. The standard 30-day waiting period has been waived for properties affected by flooding on federal land that has been caused or made worse by wildfires. For the waiting period exception to be considered, the policy must be purchased no later than 60 days after the fire was contained. After consulting with other affected federal agencies, like the Forest Service, FEMA will make a preliminary determination if a community does have a higher risk of flooding as a result of these wildfires. FEMA will then issue bulletins identifying these communities. The law requires a property-by-property determination for this exception to the 30-day waiting period to apply. So if there is a flood claim in these communities, the claims adjuster assigned to the property will determine if the flood damage was affected by flooding from federal land that recently experienced a wildfire. Of course, this policy must be bought no later than 60 days after the fire was declared contained. These new policies affected by the wildfire exception, when written, will have the standard 30-day wait. But if there is a claim and it meets all the requirements of the wildfire exception, the insurer is authorized to change the policy effective date to eliminate the 30-day waiting period. All provisions of the NFIP flood insurance policy still will be in force. The wildfire exception will not apply if a flood is already in progress when the application is submitted, or if the flood damage occurred before the application is submitted. The wildfire exception will not apply if the application is purchased later than 60 days after the wildfire's containment date. Of course, the wildfire exception will not apply if the flood damage is not caused by flooding in a community identified by FEMA. And finally, the wildfire exception will not apply if the community doesn't participate in the NFIP. If an uncontained wildfire is currently burning, based on consultation with the U.S. Forest Service, FEMA will determine if there is an elevated risk of flooding in the communities within the vicinity of these wildfires. FEMA will then make a preliminary determination to provide notice to the Write Your Own insurance companies and other stakeholders that the exception to the 30-day waiting period may be in effect. However, if you'll remember, the actual determination on the applicability of the wildfire exception must be made on a property-by-property basis by the claims adjuster. Let's go through 3 scenarios to illustrate when the wildfire exception would be applied. In our first example, the wildfire is declared contained on June 30th. The policy was purchased on June 23rd. A flooding event then occurs on federal land that results from or is made worse by the post-wildfire conditions on that federal land. On July 1st, 2013, that flooding causes damage to a privately owned building that the policy covers. Will the 30-day exception to the waiting period apply in this case? The wildfire exception to the 30-day waiting period will apply in this case since the coverage was purchased no later than 60 days after the containment date of the wildfire, and the flooding event occurs on federal land that results from or is made worse by the post-wildfire conditions on federal land. The wildfire exception would apply. Let's move on to scenario 2. Once again, the containment date of the wildfire is June 30th. You have 60 days from June 30th to purchase an NFIP policy and for the wildfire exception rule to be effective. Flood insurance coverage is purchased on September 5th. And once again, flooding occurs on federal land that results from, or is made worse by, the post-wildfire conditions. A privately owned building is damaged by the flood on September 15th. Will the wildfire waiting period exception rule apply? The answer is no, because coverage was purchased later than 60 days after the wildfire's containment date. In this case, the standard 30-day waiting period would apply. Let's move on to our third and final scenario. The containment date of the wildfire is June 30th. The wildfire exception rule has a 60-day window of opportunity from June 30th to be effective. Coverage is purchased on August 20th within the 60-day window. Flooding occurs in a state park that results from or is made worse by the post-wildfire conditions in the state park. On August 25th, a privately owned building is damaged by that flood in a state park. Will the 30-day waiting period wildfire exception rule apply? The answer is no, because the wildfire and the flooding were on state land and not federal land. The wildfire exception rule is not in effect, and the standard 30-day waiting period applies. This would also be the case if the wildfire and the flooding were on private land. Okay, that's all the time we have for our discussion on the wildfire exception to the 30-day waiting period for flood insurance coverage to take effect. For more information on this and other flood insurance topics, be sure to check out nfipiservice.com, floodsmart.gov, and of course, FEMA.gov. This is Sonia Wood for H2O Partners, thanking you for getting with the program, the National Flood Insurance Program.